Welcome to Real Film Reviewed, the show that delivers short spoiler-free reviews of films, TV shows, and limited series, along with longer segments into crime series and documentaries. I'm Chris Cheney, and this is Real Film Reviewed. Welcome back, everyone. So on this episode of OJ Theory of the Truth, we're going to get into the case beginning with opening statements on January 24th, 1995, which was 7 months after the murders. We are going to start off right where we left off last week. The jury had been selected. 9 out of the 12 jurors were black, the optics that appeared to be in favor of OJ. And we're going to go through the case as it unfolded in 1995, featuring interview clips from the documentary OJ Made in America, directed by Ezra Edelman. So we'll start with the opening statements. Johnnie Cochran at this point had emerged as lead attorney. It's unclear on whether or not he was formally named lead attorney, but he delivered the opening statements on behalf of the defense. And during Johnny's opening statement, he mentions Mark Fuhrman and how the prosecution will try to hide him, but that he's very much a part of this case, leading into the suggestion that they will make reference to the derogatory racist statements that were previously made by Fuhrman, which we discussed in the last couple segments. He also makes reference to the LAPD, and we all know that Johnnie Cochran had a long history of taking on the LAPD in numerous cases. That was actually how Johnnie Cochran's firm gained popularity, was by the numerous cases that Johnnie Cochran took against the LAPD. Newly added third chair for the prosecution, which was Christopher Darden, delivered the opening statements on behalf of the prosecution, and he stated introducing race into the case would take it over and that the N-word should be kept out of court. So there was a juror that they got on the OJ Made in America documentary that basically confirmed that she didn't understand why Christopher Darden was there, and then after he made these statements, it was pretty clear that he was only there because he was black. Getting into the rest of what Christopher Darden said, he suggested that due to the racial sensitivity of the word, that black people would not be able to hear it and remain subjective or objective. This was a mistake number 1 by Darden, proof once again that hiring him was an obvious response to the potential race battle that they were going to face with Johnnie Cochran being appointed. And Christopher Darden is not a trial lawyer. There's things that make up a trial lawyer. Being a trial lawyer is almost a talent that you have to be born with. It's very difficult to be a talented trial lawyer by working very, very hard at it. You do have to have some kind of natural charisma, some kind of natural ability to be able to be an effective trial lawyer. And Johnnie Cochran was probably the trial lawyer, and he obviously took that opportunity to respond to the statement and stated that his remarks were the most incredible remarks that he had ever heard uttered in a court of law. He stated that black people everywhere were outraged at that very moment, and in many interviews, the statement was confirmed. I understand Darden's reasoning for why he felt he needed to say what he said, but it was very poorly worded and executed, and I would have to agree with that being a very offensive statement. There was a number of parts of the interview where there were journalists that were interviewed, and some that grew up in different areas kind of thought that Darden made a pretty good point, and that it was such a shocking word, and obviously the black people who have been hearing that word in derogatory use for years, it was pretty normal. And so it was very offensive to listen to that statement and think that black people couldn't be subjective by listening to the mere utterance of the word. So I definitely understand how that was an offensive statement and how Darden pretty much shot himself in the foot right out of the gate. So the next step would be visiting Bundy and Rockingham. So initially it was only supposed to be Bundy due to this being the crime scene, but Judge Ito wanted to go to Rockingham. Marcia objected to it because no part of the crime occurred in the house and felt that if they did go to Rockingham, that the only place that they should visit there would be the area where they found the glove. But Ito, being the celebrity fanboy that he was, wanted to see the inside of the house, and so he marched the jury through the inside of the house. When they went to Bundy, the scene had been completely cleaned out. The family pictures, everything that made the house a home was boxed up. And Carl Douglas, a member, one of the 9 attorneys for O.J. Simpson, confirmed that the defense team changed the scene of Rockingham. So they changed the scene and altered it according to what they felt that the jury would identify most with. So they replaced replaced most, if not all, of his pictures with famous white celebrities and friends with photos of him with black celebrities and friends, photos that he wasn't even aware existed, and they were also pulled from different sources, reprinted, and put in these frames, so they weren't even pictures that he had in his house. There was also a lithograph of a young black girl walking into an all-white school that was taken from Johnny Cochran's office and placed at the top of his stairs. So Marcia automatically recognized this when she walked in and objected, but it was overruled. It was clear that the defense was pushing the envelope and that Judge Ito was allowing and was going to allow that going forward. So Carl Douglas pretty much didn't feel like there was anything wrong with that, but did admit to them altering the scene. So the second piece to this, to kind of talk about Judge Ito's fanboyism, he hired Dominic Dunny. Well, he didn't hire him, but he requested Dominic Dunny to be the kind of the writer, the chronicler of the case from day to day. Dominic Dunny gained a little bit of popularity. Aside from being a famous writer, his daughter was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, and the ex-boyfriend got off with pretty much a slap on the wrist. So Dominic Dunny was somebody that Judge Ito felt would show sensitivity when he wrote about the case, particularly with the Goldmans and the Browns, the families of the victims. So Dominic Dunny met frequently with Judge Ito. On one of those occasions, he did state that Judge Ito showed him autographs and a picture that was signed by Arsenio Hall, and it was clear to him what a Hollywood whore he was. So he was kind of a little bit concerned about that, but that was something that was noticed by him and mentioned previously. So the next thing was the abuse history that the prosecution presented. This was supposed to be kind of explain motive and explain how the abuse led to the murder. So there was a safety deposit box that belonged to Nicole that was opened after her death. They had to obtain a court order and drill a hole to open it, and inside they found letters, a whole bunch of photographs, Polaroids, and a handwritten will dated 1990. And her sister testified to the abuse that Nicole told her that she suffered from for years at the hands of OJ. She testified to seeing OJ not just physically but verbally abusing her, calling her names like Fat Pig when Nicole was pregnant, and a number of other things. The prosecution also played the 911 calls, the ones from the two that were most famous, the one from New Year's Eve in 1989 in the beating where the operator could hear her being beaten on the other line, and another famous one in which OJ had broken into Nicole's house on Gretna Green Drive after they were divorced, and that's the one that we probably have heard a few times, where he's yelling and screaming about her being with a man while his kids were in the house. At the time, she was seeing a man named Keith. The kids were asleep, and they were intimate in another part of the house, in a private part of the house, and OJ was actually watching them, and that had been something that was mentioned in the OJ Made in America documentary, where OJ would have her followed frequently. He would follow her himself frequently. He would spy on them and basically come back to Nicole later and chew her out about it. So that's something that was mentioned by a few people that he did. Pretty odd, Keith included. And the bad part about this was that the jurors felt bad, but they didn't really see why it was relevant to the case. And at that point, the prosecution realized that this was going to become an uphill battle, because if the jury doesn't understand how the abuse and the years of abuse is motive for murder, then they're really going to have to step it up a little bit. Which brings us to Ron Shipp's testimony. So Ron Shipp, we talked about him in the previous segments. He meets with Christopher Darden, who on purpose most likely leaves to take a phone call, and leaves the case file of Ron and Nicole on his desk. So there, inside that case file were some pictures of Ron and Nicole, not together, but just some nice pictures of them in their life. And then after that were some images, or were some photographs of the crime scene. And Ron Shipp knew Nicole, and he, as an LAPD cop, was seeing her now as he had been an LAPD cop, so he's now seeing his friend the way that he's been on so many murder calls that have traumatized him. So he said looking at those photos changed him. And after Christopher Darden came back in the room, he looked at him and said that he was testifying. So Ronald Shipp testifies to the inconsistencies of OJ's cut on his finger and the stories that he told and what he overheard him saying, and also how OJ had told him he had dreams of killing Nicole. What do you do with a credible witness? Tear down the credibility. So Carl Douglas buried him by making him out to be an alcoholic womanizer and basically tearing him down and tearing down the credibility of his testimony along with it. And everybody else that the prosecution prosecution was gathering up to testify to kind of the same types of things, as well as the explosive behavior that OJ had demonstrated, all mysteriously got amnesia after Ron Shipp's testimony. So what ends up happening with that, I felt like that was pretty easy for the defense. I thought he was to be honest, he was a strong witness, but when you look at the grand scheme of things in the case, he was fairly weak. Just like Fung. I don't know why they put Fung on the stand either, but Fung was one of the CSIs, I guess, that was collecting some of the DNA evidence, and we'll get to him a little bit later. But we'll go on to the media circus. We've been kind of talking about Judge Ito, but this case was already a media circus. They began referring to the case as the trial of the century fairly early. They authorized cameras in the court, and at the time, obviously, this is 1995, there was no internet or Fox or MSNBC. There was one news station, and CNN covered the case gavel to gavel. During the jury selection, Faye Resnick, those of you that know that name, Faye Resnick has been on Keeping Up with the Kardashians. She's still pretty good friends with Kris Jenner, but Faye Resnick supposedly was friends with Kris Jenner as well as Nicole, and she published this trashy book which detailed the lives of Brentwood party girls, which included Nicole, allegedly, and this was released during that jury selection, so it was clear from jump that this was going to get pretty out of control. And because of that media circus, pressure began to build on the case and within the city.
A black man in America who was accused of killing a white woman.
Black hero killing white woman. Black men kill a white woman. That happens. Nobody cares. But black American hero killing white woman was a giant thing.
He was banded as the trial of the century. And my mother said, if OJ had killed Marguerite, this would not be the trial of the century, and his black ass would be in jail.
Good old Mark Fuhrman. So just to recap, Detective Mark Fuhrman was the detective that found the glove at Rockingham and talked with Kato Kalin the morning of the murders. In 1985, he responded to a 911 call by Nicole, and just to give you kind of a brief story of what happened there, this is when OJ had a bat and he had smashed in the windshield of the Mercedes that they had. When Fuhrman arrived, he actually saw Nicole sitting on the car with OJ and the bat, and Mark Fuhrman took out his billy club because OJ was refusing to put the bat down and he wasn't responding at all, and he responded and said that it was like a wave that came over him and he put the bat down and was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, officer." And Nicole declined to make a report at that time, and Fuhrman pretty much had his opinion about it and stated that it's your life. And he remembered when he had responded there before, which is the only reason why the detectives had asked him to take them to Rockingham. It was because he had been there before. So the accusation by the defense was that they believed that he bagged one of the gloves at Bundy and brought it to the crime scene at Rockingham. But as Detectives Van Adder had stated, 15 people saw the glove at Bundy before Fuhrman even got to the scene. Fuhrman didn't know who did it, so to frame OJ, he would need to know that OJ didn't have an alibi. So it was just really unrealistic, and Marcia knew she couldn't enter the glove evidence, and if she didn't enter the glove, it made it seem like he planted the glove. So she had no choice. F. Lee Bailey pretty much took this as free game and cross-examined Fuhrman because he had a plan the whole time for him, because the defense investigator that F. Lee Bailey had hired told him about Fuhrman and the case that he had filed against the Los Angeles Pension Department, asking to be removed from the police force and still be allowed to collect a pension because his time on the force had poisoned his mind and he had a dislike for black people. So they knew this prior to the start of the case, and F. Lee Bailey wanted him to lie. So he flat out asked him if he said the word nigger, and Fuhrman replied that he had not. So obviously this can impact credibility due to him having said that he wanted him to lie on the stand, but it also kind of shows that it could tear down Fuhrman's credibility. In my opinion, I really would have objected relevance. It never would have came out. The evidence wasn't in question, nor was it challenged. So the results of the evidence it would have never even came out. So I don't know. Maybe that was a prosecutional error. Not certain about that.
The way you work around something like that is to deal with the physical, objective evidence that we had. This was a case about blood. That was the heart
of the case. Simpson had cuts on his left hand, particularly on the middle knuckle.
How did you get the injury on the hand?
To the left hand side of the bloody shoe prints, walking away, there were 5 blood drops found. Those blood drops were tested through different DNA analyses and by different labs, and it came back to Simpson. Quite simply, that was Simpson's blood. Inside the Bronco, we have Nicole's blood, we have Ron's blood smeared inside there, and we have OJ's blood. 2.1 miles away from the Bundy crime scene, we've got blood drops in the driveway, blood drops inside the house.
The best thing about scientific evidence is that it's objective, it doesn't have biases or prejudices. That's why we concentrated so much on DNA. We went to 2 labs, first time ever that's been done. We gave them sample after sample. We gave the opportunity to prove that it wasn't O.J. Simpson. I could have been the biggest hero perhaps in Los Angeles, if not the country, if I could have walked into court a week after he'd been arrested and said, guess what, it's not O.J. Simpson. But all the DNA evidence points to Mr. Simpson as being the person who committed those horrible crimes.
All right, let's talk about the evidence a little bit. So we know that Fung is the CSI that they put on the stand to interview, and Barry Scheck pretty much rips him apart. And the basis of his cross-examination is the bad collection practices. So rather than question the validity of the DNA evidence that was collected and the tests that were performed, because they did take them to different crime labs as well, they cross-referenced to make sure that everything matched. So rather than attacking the validity of the evidence, Barry Scheck throws out the ability in which it was able to be admitted into court by challenging the methods that it was collected. One of the biggest examples is that Fung was caught on tape as they were collecting and bagging evidence and different things like that. He was caught touching the envelope that contained Judy Brown's glasses in it that Ron Goldman was bringing over to Nicole's house. So he ended up touching that envelope with his bare hand, and they got a video of that, and it made for a pretty dramatic court demonstration as well. But he was pretty colorful, Barry Scheck. He was an expert in DNA evidence, so he knew that there wasn't really going to be a way to get around the DNA evidence, so he had to get it thrown out. They claimed also that there was EDTA in OJ's blood, and they suggested that they took the vial of OJ's blood and sprinkled it all over the crime scene, which, according to Marcia Clark, was just the biggest bunch of bullshit. And I kind of laughed about that myself, because it just is totally, I don't even understand how that would be possible. They collected the blood from OJ after the crime scene gathering, so I just don't really fully understand exactly how that could have even occurred. I do know that there was some crossover in the time frame that they were collecting evidence, and when OJ was being questioned and the blood was taken, the blood was actually taken from the lab over to Rockingham to the criminologist, and that was something that the defense brought up as well, because why would you bring a vial of blood back to a crime scene where you're collecting blood? It's just not really heard of. So these types of collection practices are the kinds of things that pointed holes in the prosecution's case. Little known fact, EDTA is in everything we eat. There's low levels of EDTA in our bloodstream right now as we're sitting here, and that was something that's been brought up in a number of other cases as well too, but it is common. If you look at the ingredients on some of the things that you eat, you can see EDTA in there. It's a preservative. So that was one of the things that was fairly interesting as far as the collection practices. I myself thought that that was very disorganized and kind of embarrassing. So the next thing, the glove. So let's talk about the glove that was found at Rockingham. So there were 2 gloves that were found. One that was found at Bundy, which was the left-hand glove, and the right-hand glove was found at Rockingham behind Cato Kalin's bungalow on O.J. Simpson's property. So the glove, the right-handed glove that was found at Rockingham, contained Ron, Nicole, and O.J. Simpson's blood. Pretty hard to get a combination of those things unless 3 people are around each other bleeding. And usually that doesn't happen unless you're killing 2 people. Further research into the glove shows that this was an exclusive glove from Bloomingdale's. There was a credit card receipt that was presented with Nicole Brown Simpson's signature on it, where she purchased 2 pairs of these gloves, small and extra large. And as a side note, one of the jurors also said this piece, and it's the piece that kind of kills me whenever I think about what Christopher Darden did, was she could see at 24 years old that the glove appeared big on Johnny's hand. And she literally stated, "You don't have to do anything. I can see that glove is big on his hand. Had he not tried that glove on, I would have assumed that glove fit." But good old F. Lee Bailey, once again, an outstanding trial lawyer, goes over to Christopher Darden, and by F. Lee Bailey's own admission, this was the direct quote that he said. He said, "Chris, you know you're a good shit, but you've got the balls of a stud field mouse. That glove will never fit OJ, and if you don't show the jury that, I will." And basically pushed Christopher Darden, and he suddenly wanted to try this glove on.
Says, "I want to do it." And I told him in no uncertain terms why we should not be doing this. And he said, "Well, if we don't, they will." And I said, "Then let them. Let them. And we can show why it was a bullshit experiment. It was never going to work between the shrinkage and the latex. It's never going to fit him the same way. Don't do this. Don't do this." It was the biggest fight Chris and I ever had.
The funny thing about the glove, he didn't want to put them on. He said, "Look, if you're worried about the gloves fitting or not fitting, just don't take your arthritis medicine. No big deal." And he said, "Mike, my hands would hurt like hell." And I said, "Why would they hurt like hell?" And you just see the light click, just hands would get swollen, couldn't bend his knuckles. So he didn't take arthritis medicine for like 2 weeks. You think that hurt it? Well, he couldn't bend his hands. You tell me.
So we pretty much know what happened with the glove demonstration, in which you can see that in the OJ Made in America documentary. OJ basically stands up, goes into full Naked Gun acting mode, and goes into this huge demonstration of milking the fact that the glove doesn't fit. In my opinion, I still feel like it looked like it fit, except for the reasoning why it wouldn't, which is it being tried on with the latex gloves, it being shrunk from the blood, and things like that. So that was actually what Marcia was wanting to show, as you heard in that clip, and also as you can hear in the clip that Mike Gilbert, who is or was O.J. Simpson's sports agent, he was part of the reason why the gloves didn't fit OJ in the clip that we just heard. So there's a bunch of little things like that Mike Gilbert did. He was also one of the gentlemen that helped OJ earn money while he was in prison. They would take letters and panels of footballs and things like that for OJ to sign, along with pictures and things like that. And then they would make footballs out of the panels, stick the letters on jackets and other things, and sell the merchandise. So because OJ was still technically innocent until proven guilty, he was able to continue to partake in the business that had nothing to do with, his crime, which was being a celebrity and signing autographs. So there would be times when he would go through 2,500 cards and he'd go, okay, and he'd do the math. And this is actually coming from Mike Gilbert, where he would sit there and watch him and he would say, okay, $2,500 cards times $25. And he'd say, not bad. And I guess he made about $3 million while he was sitting in a prison cell doing that. So Mike Gilbert has a bunch of things that he released in a book that was called How I Helped OJ Get Away with Murder, in which he releases a couple of different things, and we're going to listen to another clip from Mike later. So the tapes came out on Fuhrman. That was pretty much the only other bombshell that came out. There were tapes that Fuhrman had interviewed with a screenwriter, and he used the word nigger very loosely, as if it didn't bother him, as if he said it all the time. So the important part of this is that it proves that Fuhrman lied on the stand about saying the word nigger, and he did that because he didn't want the case to get conscrewed. He didn't want it to look like he planted any evidence, things like that. I would have preferred for the prosecution to just present the reasoning why Fuhrman could not have done it rather than trying to present it the way that they did. So that was kind of my take on it. But again, the court of law, there's not really a whole lot of fair play. You can't say things out of turn, and you can't always have the jury hear every single piece of the case. And we are going to talk about the jury because that was a huge thing that a lot of people weren't aware of, that the jury went through a lot. This trial being 267 days long, that's about 8, almost 9 months of being away. So not to mention they were sequestered. And I don't think a lot of people know that they were sequestered once the jurors started getting booted. There was a few of them that started getting booted for random reasons. There was kind of a prosecution battle against the defense, back and forth with getting jurors booted, and once that started happening, Judge Ito sequestered the jury, so they were not allowed to talk to anyone. They weren't even allowed to talk to other jurors. No TV, no media, no magazines. Any reading material that they had needed to be approved before they read it, before they had it and brought it to their room. So it was a really uncomfortable experience for the jury, who, imagine being on jury duty for 9 months out of the year. It's insane. I can't even imagine what they must have gone through. But that again, right there, makes it kind of unfair almost for them to be in that type of situation and still expect to be fair during this trial. So we'll get into the closing statements. And those closing statements, I know, are probably some of the most famous things that you've heard about this trial. You hear Marcia Clark making a strong plea to the jury to basically remember everything that had been forgotten about. So it was kind of a last-ditch effort to highlight the important details of the case, which were the facts. And Johnny Cochran, in his infamy, uttered a phrase that was actually written by Alan Dershowitz. I know a lot of people don't know that. Alan Dershowitz was the Harvard attorney. He was a professor at Harvard, but he was an attorney who was also one of the OJ attorneys, and he worked predominantly at Harvard in Boston, so he would usually fax things to them in court from his office. And one of the things he faxed was, "If the gloves don't fit, you must acquit." And I know everybody remembers hearing that. So that was pretty much the end of the trial. The closing statements were it. Beginning on part 4, we will go over the verdict and then a little bit of what happened with OJ's life following the trial. Thanks for listening to Real Film Reviewed. Before I go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to listen. Make sure to join the Real Film Reviewed Discord if you haven't already, where we break down this episode further in post-show text channels. Follow Real Film Reviewed on Twitter at RealFilmPKC. Happy watching, everyone.